this, as I have mentioned now probably many times, that we really wanted to make a city builder, and City Skylines is really the dream project for us.
Yeah, and I felt like that was one of the first things that really grabbed me. When I came down to the neighborhood level, I felt this kind of visceral, emotional connection. What would it feel like to be in that neighborhood? Now, how would it feel like to be on that street? And that was something that I don't think I ever had with any previous version of SimCity at all.
The whole game is about the city. It's not so much into individual citizens, but just about making a thriving, beautiful city that looks like you want it to be.
I'm not a city planner, but there's probably a high possibility that at certain points in the real world, cities do not grow following just RCI and simple metrics. There's a lot of under-the-counter workings and whatnot. So outside of simulating a farm town, I think maybe city simulator games can't do much more than what already exists.
Maybe it's just me, but the city builder seems like a solved problem, for better and worse. You have one viable, thriving option these days, and it's City Skylines, and that's it. Or, look, here's SimCity 4 from almost 20 years ago. Or, look, here's an older game in the Legendary series. Actually, let's hang out with this one a bit. It seems like there's about as much choice in the genre now as there was when it debuted in the late 80s, and it was Will Wright's original SimCity and literally nothing else. As much as it kinda breaks my heart, very few would probably recommend the imploded failure that was 2013's SimCity, a game that Skylines literally owes its existence to. For this reason, and many more that we're going to spend this review going over, both of these games seem to be locked into a mortal conflict with each other, despite the fact that SimCity was dead and buried before Skylines released to become a massive hit and the de facto modern city builder. I don't think it's a stretch to say that City Skylines has more content available for it than every other city builder ever released combined, or that it's probably the most critically awarded game, and definitely one of the best-selling city builders of all time. In short, Skylines, Skylines, Skylines. The thing is, I never really fell in love with it. It's an emotionally cold game. It's hard to understand at times. It just kind of feels like an elaborately animated spreadsheet. At times. And look, while I've had a real affection for SimCity since it released, at least after they patched it to a mostly playable state after its disastrous launch, I really don't think I'm going to sway any minds here. These games are years old with very established and even hardened fan bases, even if one is dramatically larger than the other. This is also not a zero-sum affair. It's not SimCity or City Skylines, it's very much both in differing quantities. I bought my copy of City Skylines on sale in 2016 and I really gave it a shot. I actually gave it multiple shots and I just couldn't get into it. Last year, while crunching to release weekly videos, I wanted to give Skylines my best effort yet to understand and play and potentially enjoy. It wasn't intended to be a full review, but to document my thoughts on the base game in comparison to my time with SimCity's base game without mods or expansions or any other DLC. Mono-y-mono, straight out of the box as each developer had intended. The resulting video was, well, it was probably as well received as SimCity was. Comparing the games like that in their base forms, it was hard for me to understand why Skylines was so popular and critically praised when SimCity had done so much to shake up the genre despite Electronic Arts' mishandling and infamous always-on internet connection mandate, even if you were playing alone. But on top of that, I've become really invested in how cities are built in the real world with a dream of getting a degree in urban planning, so I've become really cynical at how both games, and indeed the entire genre, have approached the literal act of building a city. That was its own video last year, but it's something I want to touch on here a bit later. As a huge fan of urban planning, I didn't want to leave Skylines at that. I wanted to understand this game. At the same time, after all these years, there's still a spirited debate about the merits of SimCity, which carries the reputation of being an unkempt, smoldering radioactive crater, a disaster zone that EA both created and never bothered to clean up. For me, the time finally came for me to explore these games with a full-length review, to really dig in to see what I was missing about both games to really understand the mechanics, where these games came from, and why I stand by some of my points in my original video, but have evolved some of my positions in the face of new evidence. You know, the good faith scientific approach. So after all of my examination and playtime, would I still consider City Skylines a terrible SimCity? No, I wouldn't, but maybe not for the reasons you may expect. While lots of people peering into this review will already have well-established opinions and experiences, there's simply no way this video can be exhaustive. So I'll spare you the synopses of every single Skylines DLC and how they work and what they add and change and so forth. This is not going to be a vivid and thorough breakdown of every single mechanic or issue that has happened to both games over the course of years. It's just not going to happen. This also works because I didn't buy all of that DLC, and neither should you. So let's set the stage here. It's 1996 and I'm really getting into gaming for the first time ever. My brother and I had Game Boys as kids. We owned a Super Nintendo to play all the latest and greatest Nintendo platformers, but PC gaming of the mid-90s is really opening my mind in a huge way to what video games can do. In TIE Fighter, I can be a pilot in the mighty Imperial Navy against an insurgent rebellion. In Master of Orion, I can start with a single solar system and conquer the entire galaxy. In SimCity 2000, I can build a complex, thriving city from scratch, and that blew my mind at 12 years old. The nebulous they say you find your favorite games at that age, and these were all games with a scale and complexity that consoles just weren't capable of. Although they did manage to squeeze SimCity 2000, Command & Conquer, and XCOM UFO Defense onto the original PlayStation. Somehow. Yuck. I got really good at building profitable SimCity 2000 metropolises, and it was the first game I had ever played way into the early morning, way past my bedtime. My middle school participated in the Future Cities competition, in which teams of 3 got together to design future cities that, I believe, legitimate urban planners would evaluate. The cherry on top? We used SimCity 2000 to design those cities. So we literally got to play one of my favorite games in a school computer lab. Of course, I was immediately on board. They repeatedly beseeched us to use the loan sheet that would allow us to build whatever city we wanted with nearly unlimited funds, essentially painting the khaki landscape however we felt proper. But I don't think I got the full effect of the competition, because aside from a 45-minute informational meeting to kick everything off, we never actually learned anything about urban planning or design. Our team's end product wasn't some model of urban utopia, but me showing off how well I could play the game with solar plants residing in the middle of residential neighborhoods. Playing it that way, it seems natural that my team didn't win, but we did get a cool certificate for showing up. Over the next 15 years, Maxis released 2 more mainline SimCity games, but even with graphical updates and additional complexities and mechanics, it wasn't until 2013 SimCity that I felt the city builder evoked that same sense of wonder and excitement I felt learning 2000 as a kid. For reasons we're going to explore in a huge way, that SimCity, henceforth just SimCity, failed and faded away from the collective memory like a lucid nightmare. From the ashes of that flagship city builder's colossal and immediate collapse emerged a newcomer from a tiny indie developer, City Skylines, henceforth Skylines, a game that has captured the dollars and mindshare of the entire city builder market. But to answer this question of which game is better, or if it even matters at all, we have to understand where these games came from. The history of Maxis could be a whole video all its own, but it was founded by Will Wright and Jeff Braun, of Braun Lamadome fame, to publish SimCity, their first game. I just finished reading Sid Meier's memoir, and he described the sea change in gaming that SimCity created, in which a game could be focused on building and creation instead of shooting, squashing, slashing, and destruction. This would even inspire him to create the games he's most known for, Railroad Tycoon and a little game, may have heard of it, Civilization, I think they call it. Will Wright would work with Fred Haslam to make SimCity 2000 in 1993, a revolutionary step forward in presentation and simulation that all subsequent city builders have derived inspiration from. Thanks to my Patreon supporters, I was able to reacquire the SimCity 2000 strategy guide, a kind of holy book in my youth, and in the foreword, Will Wright, with tongue in cheek, describes that the game's creation drove him insane. I got to ask him about this years later, and he said, with some hesitance, that SimCity 2000 was a fun game to put together. Like so many developers turned publishers in the 90s, and once the external shareholders got involved and installed their own executives, it came time to exploit Maxis' sim branding. While Wright was largely left alone to work on his own projects as a creative genius, the rest of Maxis was tasked with making endless sim titles while branching into other unfamiliar genres like adventure games and edutainment titles. Eventually, this strategy wore thin as the quality of the titles decreased, sales dried up, and Electronic Arts bought Maxis in 1997. Wright continued to be left alone to his own devices under EA, but he was done making city builders. While he focused on creating The Sims and later an incredibly ambitious Spore, others at Maxis took on SimCity 3000. At first, they tried a fully 3D version, but that was a big ask of home PCs at the time. The game that shipped was, well, not really the one I'd waited years for, and certainly far less ambitious. Even in 1999, it felt like SimCity 2000 with a fresh coat of paint, and far too much Comic Sans everywhere. When SimCity 4 launched in 2003, I was even less impressed. I waited until it was packaged into one of those wide box deluxe editions with the Rush Hour expansion, and despite being the dominant city builder for well over a decade after, I just didn't care for it at all. In early 2012, now years since Will Wright's departure, rumors swirled of a whole new SimCity game, and at that year's Game Developers Conference, Electronic Arts and Maxis unveiled a very interesting CGI trailer in which cities worked together to resolve mutual issues. This signaled the first natively multiplayer SimCity game in nearly 2 decades. We also saw modular structures built on the technology they had developed for Spore. And then there were the, very small city lots. So that was a little scary. A few months later, we got to see the game in the digital flesh, so to speak, at E3. We were reintroduced to all those things from the CGI trailer, but in gameplay, and also how the tilt-shift rendering would work with its really tiny depth of field. They fleshed out the multiplayer that would allow players to claim lots in a region to produce mega projects like arcologies and massive airports. Each individual sim would be an individually modeled agent rather than a mass abstraction. Criminal activity could spill between cities. We'd also get curvy roads for the very first time. Yes, roads that curved instead of strictly adhering to a grid. I got to see SimCity at E3 in their tiny theater, and I was sold. Thankfully, the game was just a year away from release. Fast forward to just before its release, Maxis dropped a time-limited beta to, limited groups of people. Only this screenshot survived my time with it. Essentially, it was a demo. You were granted a single small plot of land to develop on, and only 1 real-time hour to play it before it kicked you out to a splash screen to buy the game. You could play it over and over and over again until they deactivated the beta entirely, of course, but it was definitely a tease. To say SimCity's March 2013 launch was a disaster would be selling it short. SimCity may as well have been shipped to physical and digital retail in flaming boxes. In a later interview, creative director Ocean Quigley said that Electronic Arts mandated a persistent online connection because games as a service were really picking up in the early teens, and the publisher wanted SimCity to be their flagship example. Somehow, getting a couple people to play an hour-long beta demo didn't inform them on what launch day demand would be like. So as hundreds of thousands of copies of SimCity flooded the channel, reaching would-be mayors all over the world, which then heavily and repeatedly pinged Maxis for all the critical data that this new game required, the game melted down. Because this persistent connection was required even to play single-player cities and regions, there was literally no way you could play this game so long as the servers were on fire, which they were for a while. It was so bad that even when you could connect to the server, Maxis had disabled the game's fastest in-game speed to limit calls to the server. Maxis PR was a train wreck, claiming for the longest time that an offline single-player mode was impossible, but then, a year later, releasing a patch to do just that. And then there were the other technical issues, like the awful pathfinding that sent Sims down dead-end roads, or the fact that the agents model was a bunch of fakery and your Sim citizens weren't persistent in the slightest. And then there was the strange behavior of the Sims themselves, claiming to have issues that didn't actually exist. Or what about water tables that didn't replenish, so once you soaked up all that valuable water, it was gone forever and your city was constantly parched. Or the small size of your cities. Maxis would claim that for quite some time after launch, they experimented with larger lot sizes because larger cities were one of the primary post-launch goals. But the amount of computational power required was just too much for the average PC. Players could very quickly fill a city lot before being forced to either scrap and reconfigure what they'd already built, or start a whole other city in the region. Heaven forbid you used any of those curvy new roads. The game's launch also really shook up how gaming sites reviewed content not long before Gamergate took hold. EA had given privileged outlets a very optimal build of the game before launch to experience the game as it was designed at the time, and their glowing scores reflected that. But then the game's freshness seal was broken. Perhaps the most damning example was Russ Pitts' review for Polygon, in which he initially gave the game a 9.5 out of 10, and then the game released and it fell to an 8, then a 4, before finally settling at a 6.5, a full gulf from the initial near-perfect score it received initially. It was my frustration with media outlets' rush to get half-assed perfunctory verdicts in front of their SEO-driven crowds that inspired me to create the Nth review in the first place. Because of the constant, complex issues involving the servers, Maxis spent a huge amount of its bandwidth on just getting the game running, rather than fulfilling a lot of the creative vision they had for it. Cars stopped going down dead-end roads on the way to their destinations as much. The game had a lot of content and stability updates. They added DLC and released an expansion that September, Cities of Tomorrow, that followed through on augmenting the creative potential of the city while doing basically nothing to resolve any of the game's fundamental issues. Electronic Arts then wrote the whole thing off, never allowing Maxis to build the SimCity they dreamt of, closing the original Maxis Emeryville studio in March of 2015 and relocating employees to their Redwood Shores campus across the bay. Because of Electronic Arts' meddling, SimCity never really had a fair shake. Its reputation never outgrew its horrible first year, and it's remained a melted-down, toxic disaster site ever since, despite being a relatively stable game today. That left a massive, SimCity-sized hole in the city builder market, and there was one team ready to move in on it. Colossal Order is a tiny Finnish game studio formed in 2019, many from a mobile developer called Universimo, that wanted to make a city builder in the waning years of SimCity 4's dominance. But they couldn't because that costs money, even in Finland, and because their team was so small. They drew on help from academic institutions, and after lengthy publishing negotiations, Paradox, known for their intricate strategy games, wound up as their publisher. Cities in Motion, which released in 2011, and Cities in Motion 2, which released in 2013, just a month after SimCity's disastrous debut, were not city builders, but rather public transportation management sims. The cities were handcrafted ahead of time by Colossal Order, but you set up bus and rail and trolley lines, built depots, established stops and routes, acquired vehicles, and got people from point A to point B and occasionally, on the weekends, point C. As an advocate of public transportation in my own city, I can confirm, having purchased the second game, that it is pretty rad. It's a very dry game, and there's not a lot of help when the game doesn't do precisely what you want it to do, but it's actually a game I'd love to sink more time into when this review and Dyson Sphere program aren't so busy devouring my life. But then, something changed.
We always wanted to make a city builder. When SimCity was announced, we were like, okay, that's it. We're never going to be able to do anything with this. Then it didn't go exactly as they planned, probably, so we thought, there's still hope.
There was no way that the average fan could have seen the impending failure of SimCity, much less Colossal Order. But when it happened, publisher Paradox saw the gap. So City Skylines was born, not to be confused with the City series by the now-defunct publisher Monte Carlo. Colossal Order had a huge advantage in being able to immediately learn and develop from the failures of SimCity. So, bigger maps. Much bigger maps. And mods. None of that hacky stuff. Skylines could embrace full efforts to modify and change and add things that people want because they're from the people who want it, and other people will probably want it too. Skylines also lifted a lot of the aesthetic from SimCity as well, like the interface, the tilt shift effect, the white box style info view, etc., etc. We'll dive into that a bit later. And the thing is, they did all of this with a team of less than a dozen people compared to however many hundreds of people were assigned to work on SimCity. I couldn't find a head count on the Maxis team, but I'd imagine it was substantially larger, and that really is a testament to Colossal Order's talent. Despite only receiving a fraction of the press attention ahead of their release, what followed is history. Once the underdog, City Skylines is now the premier city builder, having outsold SimCity several times over. It's a tool used by city planners and academics to examine urban detail, simulate traffic, and teach planning. David truly did slaughter Goliath here. But both games have their pros and their cons, and there are absolutely reasons why I enjoy SimCity despite its colossal failure, and we're going to get into why. This review is broken into two sections plus a conclusion. The first sets up the early game, in which the games are functionally similar, but the second sets up the mid and late game, where the games diverge greatly. So let's dive in.
City Skylines isn't meant to be a city simulator, it's a city building simulator. You're looking at this game on face value without any consideration on how the community plays it. It'd be great if you stopped unironically saying that SimCity 2013 is better as a game, not considering the fact that City Skylines is literally a platform for education, design, and art. It's not just another city game.
To understand these two games requires laying out in their very broadest sense what they're trying to do. SimCity wants to be a game. City Skylines wants to be a simulator. The terrain of SimCity feels like a game board with a camera that has a more orthogonal perspective that keeps things in clean parallel lines, even as you zoom in, something that mimics its 2D predecessors. Each structure and fixture you place has a certain weight to it, with a slight camera shake as if you literally stamped the ground with them. Taller buildings are typically tapered as to not obstruct what's behind them too much. Bulldozing structures comes with dramatic and weighty destruction animations. There's a visceral feel here that Maxis' team of artists have created that the things you do matter. The game features chains of goals and explicitly clear tech trees and building hierarchies to help you build towards larger end goals, as though you could somehow beat the game. City Skylines takes a different tack, more like an artist painting on a canvas. You play with the camera a little more zoomed out to take in the whole scene. There are impressive simulations going on under the hood, and it's not long before the cities you create look similar to something you'd explore in Google Maps. Yes, the game provides some guidance and detail, but it feels like a sandbox where your virtual funds and imagination are the limiting factors. There are loads of menus here full of options that don't really make sense at first blush, and sometimes don't feel meaningful even after you've been playing for dozens of hours. In many ways, its make-your-own-fun philosophy truly feels like a logical extension of the SimCity lineage. Out of the box, these two games are not equal, and a straight comparison actually seems unfair to Skylines, a game assembled by a couple of handfuls of developers in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the resources. Playing these two games back to back, you really feel the chasm between them in presentation, features, and gameplay. Both games feature downloadable content and mods, which we'll get into a bit later. But Skyline's success has allowed it to quickly compensate for its initial flaws thanks to its passionate community and a lengthy and even controversial list of downloadable content that can total close to $200 if you elect to purchase it all. I've wanted to return to these two games in that full interview format, but like so many commenters pointed out in the original video, the only true way to play Skylines is to download a bunch of mods and grab some essential DLC that patches in features and content that SimCity had baked in from the get-go, like disasters and specialized industries. So I spent $80, the equivalent of 10 more copies of City Skylines based on my Steam sale receipt, to get what millions of others have already gotten, and to try and make a fair comparison between these two games. And yet, as you start playing these games, they seem very, very similar. If you've never played a city builder before, this may all look pretty sophisticated and complex, and it certainly can. But each of these games starts with these same relatively easy steps that the genre's had for decades. With your blank landscape in front of you and a fistful of cash, you plant residential, commercial, and industrial zones for people to live, shop, and work. You need roads to make sure people can move between these areas. These zones need power and water. You'll expand with more zones and build more roads, and eventually you'll need to establish fire services to fight disasters, police to, stop crime, education, parks, and so on. You'll have to step in and play administrator to manage taxes and ordinances so that your virtual citizens can or don't do this or that. As the years have rolled on, they've added more stuff and tweaked things here and there, like connections to external cities, but by and large, this is how all of these mainstream city builders start. But it becomes apparent pretty quickly that both games have their own quirks. One of SimCity's biggest components is modular buildings, a feature lifted successfully from Will Wright's Spore and its various creation tools. You plop down one of your specialized buildings, from police stations to wind power farms to your own city hall, and you're given the option to augment its abilities or scale that service's tech tree. On top of that, you can install even more vehicles that allow these facilities to accomplish their jobs better or retrieve more resources. This means you can install a service in your town, and then as you have the money and ability, you can simply upgrade these buildings rather than having to install an entirely new facility like you do in Skylines or any previous SimCity game, which is vital because you have such little space to work with. This is the only game with this feature, although Skylines does kind of tease it with its parks, and I'm sure there's a mod for this as well. When you play SimCity's modular buildings, they provide helpful guides for how much space a fully expanded structure will occupy, so you can place them optimally. But sometimes you'll have to take the L and upgrade what you can where you can. Modular buildings might be my favorite feature of the entire game. Meanwhile, in Skylines, all of your structures will come in prefab sizes and shapes, and that's it. If you want to expand your service's capabilities, you can build more structures, or you can tweak the budget item, which will boost how many agents that service has available to deploy, although it doesn't seem very clear how this actually affects your city, or how many agents are actually being deployed as a result. Both games have a lot to teach you, and they tackle this in different ways. SimCity offers a standalone tutorial that's just of the click on things I tell you to click on variety that both exposes you to a bunch of mechanics and how to get started, and basically nothing from the mid and late game. But it's also not particularly helpful because it holds your hands so tightly. As you play the game, it teaches by introducing problems, then offering an effective mini tutorial on the spot to understand how a mechanic works to solve that problem. It makes it far easier to learn by doing. The game also issues dynamic quests that push you to implement buildings, features, or services from the people who actually live there. It's very, very cool, it's fun, and yeah, it can definitely be repetitive, especially as you're setting up multiple cities and encountering several of the same objectives, but they're entirely optional. It's not hard to imagine that Maxis would have eventually expanded on these. Skylines, however, makes you work for its knowledge by presenting solutions without much context. The game offers a tooltip-assisted tutorial that isn't nearly as flashy as SimCity's, but it gets you started and that's what counts. As you reach each city size or industry production milestone, the game informs you of a slew of new buildings you've just unlocked. At a glance, you might be able to guess how these 1, 2, 3, 6, or even more new structures augment or change your existing services or fit into your city, but aside from the occasional tooltip, you're on your own. This can be overwhelming and even unintuitive. Skylines offers old-school methods of deploying services. Ensuring your city gets power requires erecting power lines between blobs of, electricity that should daisy-chain back to a power source. You can even build power plants that aren't tied to anything except via power lines, so you can plop them down all willy-nilly and whatever. Easy enough. Laying out water requires linking pipes to water sources in a way that's mechanically different than the power system. The pipes you lay out will have a big bloom, and so long as these big blooms wind up under structures, they get water. Again, it's an old school way to do things, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Don't worry, there are mods for that if you don't like it. SimCity, however, does this very interesting, I guess it's a quality of life update that no other game I've seen does. In this game, all of your services are served through the roads themselves. Power, water, and sewage don't require any extra infrastructure beyond how they're sourced or processed. Your Sim's poop is even modeled flowing through the roads of your town. It removes what can be some clunky, repetitive old mechanics so you can focus on more pertinent details like those modular buildings and services I mentioned earlier that'll be vital in the mid and late game. Skylines uses its traffic simulation bona fides to turn road management into its own game. SimCity has realistically modeled traffic, but doesn't have a lot of the tools to handle it beyond multimodal options, which Skylines also has. SimCity doesn't let you manage traffic very well. The things you'd think you'd need, like roundabouts or one-way roads, don't exist like they do in Skylines. Even without elaborate traffic management mods, alleviating backed-up traffic is really fun in Skylines. It doesn't have all the features of Cities in Motion, which is fine, but trying to get that traffic efficiency percentage as high as possible is an epic goal all its own. Ripping out whatever rat's nest road system you built just to get by earlier in the game and installing a full interstate system quarter mile by quarter mile is incredibly fun. You can even name each individual road and street and, well, pretty much anything else in the game, to your heart's content. Skylines also allows you to tweak how ordinances affect your city by letting you paint districts. If you want a rich, dense district to recycle, or another poorer district to have free Wi-Fi specifically, you can do this without needing to apply them city-wide, which is the only option you have in SimCity. This really reflects how big Skyline cities become and why nuance is required. Using districts for ordinances this way is interesting, but I had zero interest in micromanaging policies like this. I never really felt like ordinances were doing anything beyond draining my budget. What seemed like something that would really help my town or the people who live in it just became another batch of options that I ignored and never experienced any consequences for either way. Where the districting tool really works is in creating specific industries, my favorite part of the game, and something we'll get into a bit later. When it comes to painting, however, I wish Skylines made zoning easier. Both games require you to zone alongside roads, but Skylines just makes it more difficult. When zoning in SimCity, you can very easily paint in tiny lengths, or hold control to paint the entire lot or road, and bang bang bang, it's done. Easy. When zoning on flat grid-based terrain, Skylines is also pretty easy with the bucket fill, but these zonable areas will break up into tetramino-shaped lots when you start making curved roads or when the elevation changes. It's a very clunky situation, and Skylines tries to remedy this by offering 4 different zoning tools, like a brush, a bigger brush, the ability to paint individual squares, and the fill bucket. That fill bucket will take care of most zoning, but in more complicated situations, having to switch tools is just... It shouldn't be this difficult. SimCity, it just works. It's so fast. Both games have big individual issues that really hinder their early game. With SimCity, it's the city sizes. They're just too small. You can fill an entire city lot in 2 hours, tops, and wonder, is that it? I didn't accomplish anything. I filled the whole square just as I was getting excited about what to put in it. This really cramps the mid and late game as well, and I'll be diving into those pains later on. With Skylines, it's terrible communication. The game is more than happy to present all the raw data you could ever need, but rarely does it succeed in presenting a story about how or why things are happening in your city. If you stick to it through those early years or failed cities, you do kind of get used to it. It seems like I'm being really mean to Skylines, but the game is 6 years old and has been in active development for most of it. They could have done anything at all to improve the onboarding, but they haven't. If you're used to the glossy AAA treatment of SimCity, slipping into Skylines can feel like a huge step backwards, but as time goes on, that number of people just keeps getting smaller and smaller. But let's not get stuck in traffic because we're just getting started. One of the biggest new components of these city builders is their agents, which are small, independent AI entities. Yeah, Maxis promised that each person that moved into your town had their own house and their own job and went to that job every day, and they were persistent Sims throughout their time in your city. At least that's the bill of goods I was sold. So I know it let a lot of people down when it turned out to be a very dramatic illusion. Agents weren't new to city builders, but with SimCity and Skylines, they had a bigger role in how your city ran than ever. In SimCity 2000, per the Wonderful Strategies and Secrets Guide, each city had a maximum of 150 micro-simulations. These allow you to see how citywide systems are doing, but on bespoke buildings like City Hall, it even keeps track of fun little stats. As your city gets bigger and you encounter that simulation limit, it begins to eliminate those individual simulations, and eventually City Hall will only tell you generic property value information like every other building. In those old days, things like traffic were calculated very simply. If you have a residential zone next to an industrial zone or commercial zone, the game populates the road between them with traffic based on how far people will travel. The more valuable the zones are, alongside a bunch of other variables, the more intense the traffic. It's like a Venn diagram. And then you can introduce something like a bus station to mitigate that traffic. And that's where it got a little complicated. A fire station or a police station will have a bloom that will make Sims within a certain distance happy that they have fire or police coverage, even if you still have to deploy those units manually. But agents fundamentally change how cities work. You still have the same valuable zones, but each property now has a Sim assigned to it, and they have a job or school that they're assigned to. So an independent AI will leave their home, go to their job, and they'll be represented in-game by an individual person or car. And that's how you get real traffic in SimCity and Skylines, and so much more, like fire trucks and police cars that deploy from their stations to fight fires or handle crime. Each game spends its agent budget in different ways. Skylines invests in people and traffic, which allows it to create realistic scenes of traffic as your cities get bigger to a limit. They also model when people are going to work and what they're doing now and where they go to school. SimCity, however, uses agents to model power, water, and sewage as well. Yes, each blob of poop in your city is an individual artificial intelligence. A very simple one, but you've got some smart shit in your city. These services seem more abstracted in Skylines, but I couldn't get any hard data about it. As these agents multiply, they create ripples of behavior as they interact with each other. In a modern RPG, you'd call that emergent behavior, where randomly patrolling enemies or creatures will interact with each other unscripted and without your intervention based on a number of variables, like how much they hate each other, or how much they hate another faction, or how much they hate a creature, or whatever. These city builders do this thousands of times over. Cause meets effect meets cause meets effect over and over and over. This creates complex simulations in which you set things up and the game dominoes its way to logical conclusions, or illogical ones. Commerce can shut down entirely if the roads are clogged, which kills tax revenue, and so on. Where SimCity has an advantage in the early game is in how it presents a narrative of how your city works. Through advisors with actual faces, a staple of the series, the game presents how and why things are happening the way they are. Well, it tries really hard to anyway. With Skylines, this always felt hard to decipher, which makes sense considering communication isn't the game's strong point to begin with. It can be hard to tell why and how things are happening, and so a non-trivial amount of time is playing detective, understanding what was going on in my city, or why. But SimCity drops the ball in a pretty big way later on while dealing with regions, and we'll definitely get to that. Just like the strange, glitchy, emergent behavior of a Bethesda game, you will experience some weird, barely explained behavior in your cities. I followed a Sim, a person in Skylines versus Sim in SimCity, and watched as she went to the shop on the corner, literally half a block away. From her house, she walked to the corner where a car spawned on the sidewalk. She drove 1/10 of a mile, still had to walk across the street via the crosswalk to get to the shop, shopped, then walked home, her car just hanging out on the street where she left it. As the behavior of these agents domino, you'll notice your city's revenue fluctuate up and down wildly and rapidly, for reasons you need to dig into various menus to even get a fraction of an idea about what's going on. One of my favorite reviews of SimCity when it debuted was by Eurogamer, in which they described their cities as kind of a chaos world in which the game presents two opposing things at the same time. This got better as they patched the game, but it's more art than science, it seems. Your people in either game will complain about not having enough garbage processing abilities, even though the meters show your landfills are empty and your processing capabilities are well into the green. If you put either game under the microscope like I just did earlier, you're gonna find funny, unexplainable things going on all the time. But that's not really the point. The point is the illusion of a living city. The goal is the simulation of things working together in a way they never have before, producing more realistic cities than ever. Of course, this makes communicating what's supposed to be going on that much more important. Around the time of SimCity's release, an agent-based survival strategy game called Banished launched that focused on building an interconnected new colony that could survive the new world, the elements, and more. I struggled with this game because by the time I realized what was happening to the people in my fledgling colony, or the food supply, or how the harsh winter was taking its toll, the colony was well into a death spiral I couldn't recover from. I do give points for showmanship to SimCity though. In a specific example, you can build venues and host events in both cities. In SimCity, traffic builds up around the venue as vehicles and Sims arrive, disrupting the flow of the city. The events feel very real, with fireworks and a whole bunch of crazy crap as it happens, and the game does a really good job emphasizing how much these one-off concerts or monster truck rallies affect your town. While Skylines will highlight that these events are happening, from the outside it doesn't really seem like it at all. It's night and day, but I suppose that's why you buy the Skylines concert DLC. You don't have much of a city without zoning, and each game handles it in both different and similar ways. I've already described how you do it, but why is a different matter. SimCity keeps it simple: residential, commercial, industrial. Skylines adds offices and then splits residential and commercial densities like the good old days when you could have single-family homes and then multi-family apartment towers in different areas. It's also how it works in the real world too. It's realistic. Well, kinda. In reality, both games pretty much function the same way with different mechanics. Let me see if I can explain this in a way that doesn't suck. In both games, denser buildings will appear automatically as your property values increase and blah 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 automatically. Skylines segments these densities with what zone you use, but SimCity does it with roads. In both games you can upgrade your roads to allow for more traffic, but in SimCity this also sets the banding for how dense these zones get as well. So you start off with light, cheap roads, and you'll get tiny homes with long driveways. Upgrade those roads as you build your city, and those buildings will redevelop into skyscrapers and everything in between. Some will cry that this is a removal of choice from the player, but the reality is that both games just mask your choice in different ways. Do you want to upgrade the zone to get skyscrapers, or do you want to upgrade the roads? 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Skylines does it the old school way. SimCity seems to remove your agency by having 3 zone types instead of Skylines 6, but it actually doesn't, even if you can't zone for offices for whatever that's worth. I'm going to be honest with you though, in older games I never understood why you would zone for light industrial or residential when you eventually had the money to always zone for high density for maximum population and tax benefits. But Skylines and SimCity lay it out. Your cities need poor people. What this pandemic taught us is that essential workers aren't working in mahogany paneled offices. They're wearing a vest, apron, or scrubs, and clocking in exactly when they're needed for very little pay. If you densify and overeducate your people, they're going to demand more pay, and more importantly, not take those essential jobs. And both games will remind you regularly that they can't find workers, and not be very specific about what kind of workers you need. I assure you, there's no make stupid school in either game. Like a late 90s shooter, you're not playing Skylines right unless you've got the Steam Workshop open and are installing mods by independent creators left and right. I mean, not that Steam Workshop was around in the late 90s, but you know what I mean. Colossal Order learned from their Cities in Motion series that opening the game up for the player to tweak it to their preference was a huge deal for them, so they made sure Skylines could do it as well. Now, I'm not opposed to mods, but I can say personally that I'm just not interested in them. As someone who reviews games and enjoys designer intent, it's important for me to review the base product as purely as I can beyond just getting the game running at all and whatever modest quality of life features are required to enjoy the game. It's a real Ship of Theseus problem. At what point am I reviewing the game? At what point am I not? Both of these games have their flaws, but papering over Skylines issues with presentation and functionality modifications created by unpaid passionate volunteers, and then reviewing it just feels weird. Mods were important for a game like Half-Life 2, but that game was perfect, untouched. It still is. The mods and amateur-made expansions were a bonus. Gary's mod was a fun thing you could also do having purchased Half-Life 2. You don't need mods to make Half-Life 2 a must-have game, or even an enjoyable one. Yes, I'm saying that Skylines is no Half-Life 2. Choo-choo, Hot Takes Express coming through. That said, I had to try a few anyway. But maybe my thoughts on mods as a gamer are tainted anyway. Back in my World of Warcraft days, which was the classic 2005 era, I was downloading mods left and right to enhance my interface and present hidden information and make big buttons so I could do stuff easier and all kinds of crap. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, Blizzard would release an update that broke certain mods right as I'd gotten used to them, and it was a nightmare. Some mods wouldn't even get fixed and I'd lose them. It was very silly. Anyway, you don't need to get too far into the pool to understand why you should mod Skylines. There's countless fan-made content packs and special structures that fill in your menus like a bunch of random junk, but there are genuine quality of life fixes here too. If there's something you don't like about the game or how it plays, there's probably a mod for that. I downloaded a mod that turned all the roads into electrical conduits, so I didn't need to lay down transmission lines separately, like SimCity. It's really great. Another one I put in allowed me to expand my city beyond what the game originally designed, provided your computer can continue to handle it. I didn't download too many mods, just enough to dip my toe into, but I get the appeal. With X number of modifications, you simply blur so many of the game's flaws away like a bad dream, and that's what the developers intended. But these mods can also allow for the most insane detailed cities pretty much ever. People can build custom buildings and then modify the hell out of them and export and import and tweak things and traffic settings however you want. You can build the city you live in within Skylines too as a functional simulated replica, with some limitations. It's ridiculous the amount of detail you can achieve in this game. This can literally become the model train town you've always wanted if that kind of detail is something you're interested in. While SimCity is closed source, there are mods for it as well, but because of the uphill battle to modify the game and the game's ultimate failure, there aren't many. They expand the size of the city lots, they add one-way roads, but they also seem to have their own limitations as well because this engine was not designed for these kinds of modifications. For this review, I stuck with the stock build of the game even if it seemed like it was a disadvantage. I hate DLC, and you do too. Well, the bad stuff anyway. And because it's the future, there's premium downloadable content for these games. In either case, DLC comes in 2 formats, the bigger expansion packs and the smaller content packs. Expansion packs are nothing new. SimCities have been repackaged with extra content for decades. I remember the Urban Renewal Kit for SimCity 2000 was the first big deal, but then you have things like the Rush Hour expansion for SimCity 4 that lets you awkwardly drive vehicles to complete missions. City Builder content packs aren't new either. They've been bundled with expansion packs and Game of the Year editions for years as well, but tiny $5 to $15 purchases are. While SimCity was in flames at launch, they were bundling different themes of buildings with their limited edition and selling them separately as well. Because it's an Electronic Arts game at the end of the day, of course you could buy a Nissan Leaf branded EV charging station or a Progressive insurance office building. The latter, unfortunately, was made unavailable in 2014. You can clearly see the direction they would have gone in had SimCity been a success, and it seems oddly placed against the gleeful spirit that Maxis built into the game because Electronic Arts is a disgustingly awful piece of shit. The game's only expansion, Cities of Tomorrow, only really feels like a valuable addition in retrospect because it wasn't received very well at the time. It introduces a whole web of content, buildings, and services that augment what you do in your cities. It introduces a new resource called ControlNet that its new wares need, and it can only be effectively generated with wealthy Sims. So it only makes sense to have them in built-up city lots you're already at wit's end with. You can also buff existing structures with these new modules. Mega towers serve as modular self-contained arcologies, and you can rope them together with sky bridges without taxing your existing ground-level roads. You can even make the roads and vehicles around these ControlNet structures look super futuristic, while building maglev lines above it all, which serve as kind of a surrogate for the subway systems of the older games that didn't make it into this game. It's kind of an awkward bit of content in the grand scheme of things, but again, it teases just slightly what the game could have grown into. Okay, here we go. City Skylines. This game has a lot of DLC. A lot of DLC. As of this writing, you can buy the game and all of its DLC for a mere $220.84 here in the United States. What a bargain! Like I mentioned earlier, I bought $80 worth, which wound up being 6 of the 9 expansions and none of the frilly nonsense I don't care about. The expansions add a good chunk of content and functionality to the game. Campus lets you build a sprawling college/university district to attract those would-be brain people. Mass Transit and Sunset Harbor do what you think they do, but Industries, my favorite, let you district specific industries to gather and refine resources. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I have to wait until the next chapter to really spill the beans on it. I know, but trust me, it's worth the wait. What these expansions do, especially coming off SimCity, is add functionality into the game that game already had built in. You have to pay for industries, you have to pay for natural disasters, you have to pay for this and that. And that's not to say that SimCity is some kind of dense, feature-rich game by any means, but staples of the genre are things that have to be sold to you separately in Skylines. I guess that concerts DLC makes some big venue events I talked about earlier that were already built into SimCity, but I can only guess because that slice of content was not worth, let me see here, $7 to me. Apparently, the Park Life expansion allows you to create parks via modules similar to SimCity. If I were a stand for this game with hundreds of hours invested, sure, these might just seem like another easy pay toll for the experience, like any expansion for an MMO might be. But it's harder to justify if you're, well, not. Some of these expansions really require you to build your city around the content, and while it's physically and emotionally easier to raise an entire neighborhood in this game versus SimCity, it still seems like a lot of work to take advantage of. What's that whistle? What's that coming around the corner? The Hot Take Express? The conductor's handing me a message. Let's see what it says. Yes. All of this shit should have been free. All of these mechanic-dense additions to Skylines should be and should have been free to all players and bundled into the main game for no additional cost. Period. I realized that Paradox was banking on the fact that they had a monopoly on the city builder for the past half-decade, and there were millions of Skylines fans willing to shell out cash for functionality they didn't know they were missing because SimCity was a non-starter, but this stuff should be free, today. And I'm not picking sides either. Cities of Tomorrow should be free too. Despite the game being dead for essentially 8 years, I still had to plunk down $20 entire dollars for the SimCity expansion. Free, people. Free. And then there's all the other Skylines content, the vast majority of it being content and music packs. Yes, you can buy radio station content filled with songs by bands you haven't heard of with DJ bumps peppered in. So that's cool. There are content creator packs put together from pretty famous Steam Workshop contributors, so you can get high-tech buildings or Art Deco buildings, and then there's just other crap too. There's so much stuff in here. There's an irony here that it was EA's game that bit the dust, because you know they would have pursued a content strategy like this. It's definitely one of those live long enough to see yourself become the villain things, and it's a very contentious part of the Skylines experience, even for its whales. Even the bigger expansion packs can feel like they were thrown together with reskins or source models or whatever and barely feel cohesive. In some ways they even feel lazy, like intern Zarv needed to get something together at the last minute for his programming degree credit, and they took it, slapped a $15 price tag to it, and called it a day. I don't know any Finnish names, sorry, that was mean. Poor Zarv. If you intend to dive in after all these years, please don't buy that mega super bundle. Please don't. But do research some vital pieces you should buy that actually interest you. Despite some of the flashy advertising or enticing cover art, they might not actually be as feature-rich or put together as they may lead you to believe. Some of these really felt like getting Connects for Christmas instead of the Lego sets I wanted. It never happened to me as a kid, but I had friends. SimCity 2000 changed the freaking game when it came to modifying terrain, especially since it was the first to display elevation in a fakey early 90s 2.5D. It was magical, and it probably killed your mid-90s computer if you tried to do too much of it. This also allowed you to create specific land features, flatten the land for easier building, and so on. It was simple, but very effective. This carried through the series until this new one, and I'm here to tell you that terrain manipulation is woefully not here. Clearly they built in some kind of deformation because you can see it when trying to erect bridges or roads up and down hills. But Maxis only wanted civil engineering level terrain deformation. Basically the terrain will flatten and adjust depending on what's built on top of it, but that's it. This means, unfortunately, that there will be chunks of different city lots that are basically unusable because of the steepness or hostility of the terrain. Skylines lets you sculpt the terrain to a limited extent. It's more for smoothing things out than crafting mountains, although I'm sure there's a mod for that. There's a virtual cost when doing it in the game, but it's not a lot. The buttons aren't exactly intuitive, like this one here just always seemed to make infinitely deep wells to the underworld for some reason. Where it's even more fun is using it after a disaster that will usually cause the terrain to ripple, crack, or just be blown open outright. Using the terrain tools, you can just sew it up manually, and it's just really freaking cool. Speaking of which, both games like to shake things up, sometimes literally. Disasters happen in the real world, and their random nature in these games ensures that challenge isn't limited to your budget screen. I mean, sometimes it's fun to just destroy your city when you're bored, but developers have learned a lot from SimCity 2000 where a single uncontained fire can burn down an entire landmass. In SimCity, disasters don't need to be big, because it only takes the destruction of a few critical facilities to set you back in a huge way, because the game hinges on developing more and more elaborate chains of productivity to keep your cities going and profitable. Having a multicolored dragon fire-breathing pinata thing stomp through your city sucks. It's not fun. It's like someone tossing a pool ball at your house of cards. Disasters for Skylines are a lot more in-depth, though. And here's a gentle reminder, you have to buy them. It's a premium feature. Should you commit the dollars, when they do show up, they can also be destructive, but for different reasons. Mending your city after an earthquake is actually enjoyable. The water table can rise over your quays with a tsunami that pummels your beachfront property. Sometimes it glitches out and it keeps pummeling them over and over and over again, and it's annoying. But we have to talk about the DLC's tornadoes, and more specifically, we have to talk about one that affected my city of Enthberg. Tornadoes are hella OP, and they don't linger at the edge of your city, making you anxious that they'll cross paths with your town at some point. No, these are F5 motherfuckers that will spawn right in the middle of your busiest district and carve the most destructive streak of carnage possible, consistently. This particular tornado started in my downtown and carved right through my urban core. The disaster bumped off over half my population and extinguished all the funds I had to rebuild roads and buildings. The results rippled through my agent economy and my income plummeted. Even with a sizable loan, it wasn't until I enacted some particularly harsh austerity that the town began to recover. I was perilously close to losing dozens of hours I'd spent building the city because of a single, particularly cruel and random disaster. So, mending your cities after these disasters can be really fun, but they can also be painfully unbalanced. It's realistic in that way, but how does realism help this game? Skylines is celebrated for its realistic results, and I say that very specifically. Results. But to what end is this truly impressive? Anyone who's played a video game in the past 20 years knows that realism isn't innately fun, or impressive, or even interesting. In the mid to late aughts, games could render 3D so well that game after game just decided to look brown and gray and neutral, which was a damn waste. SimCity has never been about crafting realistic cities, it's been about playing games that let you make cities. So what does Colossal Order, and to a lesser extent even Maxis, think they gain by going in that direction? Skylines makes the case that they're an extension of where SimCity was going with 4 just a decade later.
We don't like to be compared to the newest one. I think we're really like classic, old-school SimCity.
Your cities look realistic, the buildings look plausible, even in how they're often tiled, and sometimes they are like that in the real world. The water rises and floods with its own physics model that's really kinda slow and jelly-like and weird-looking. The traffic simulations are detailed and are always cool to see. This is a simulator. Urban planners love the detail and tools and all the mods you can use to build even more with even more tools. You'll love the different types of roads, which aren't just about density, but directing traffic. And what about roundabouts? With the mod, you can turn any intersection into one for easier flowing traffic. But, I mean, it is kind of weird that these roundabouts don't reflect how roundabouts actually work, with specific yields that allow traffic inside to continue through to their exit, instead just acting like a one-way loop with traffic lights at every intersection. But hey, you can probably download a mod to fix that too. I'm sure there are mods for all those things I have issues with. I'm sure there are. Skylines even models post offices for some reason, even though that's not usually something handled at the city level, but that's true of a lot of things in this game. But then you have SimCity, which avoids the vanilla of reality as much as possible. This Polygon video exposes how the original games were based on an old, extremely mathematical series of stocks and flows that's inherently miserable for your citizens and dystopian AF. I put it in the description below. The newest SimCity explores opportunities that technology of the early 10s allowed for. In full 3D, it exaggerates the size of its Sims and the vehicles, giving you a real emotional connection to the people who live here compared to the ants that inhabit Skylines, even at the tightest zoom. The terrain looks primed and green for mini golf tournaments. You don't lay out bus routes, you simply set up bus stops, and the game simulates mass transit automatically to a mostly effective degree. It doesn't have nearly as many options in each menu as Skylines does, but choices aren't the point. It's not trying to be a Google Maps simulator. It wants you to erect neon monoliths that are a kilometer tall and looked ripped straight out of a Judge Dredd comic. Reality is already outside your window. SimCity asks what it can accomplish as a game. Another thing that separates the games is the orthogonal camera I mentioned earlier. Without the strong perspective skew in SimCity, objects that are further away from the camera are roughly the same size as objects that are closer, granting an equity and utility regardless of how zoomed in you are. Again, this allows the game to have more of a board game look and feel and makes modifying the game's plethora of modular structures easier and vital. Unfortunately, they don't provide a zoom that lets you see the entire city unless you pull out to the region view, at which point you can't interact with your city anymore. This makes managing the city slightly irritating when you start building those mega towers, but maybe that's because I placed them on the edge of the lot where I wouldn't need to destroy as much of the city's vital guts. Skylines, on the other hand, offers zoomed out views that are very useful, but cranks the perspective skew the further in you zoom. This is more realistic, but it causes buildings that are slightly further away to be substantially smaller, like, it does in the real world. This meant I was almost always playing with a more zoomed out view than my time in SimCity. The difference in these cameras seems like such a small thing, but not being able to see my entire SimCity in one glimpse is an inconvenience, while not having a useful intimate zoom really made me feel disconnected from the soul of my Skyline cities. Not having that practical, up-close view really made it harder for me to appreciate the detail of what I'd built or the consequences of my actions except in very brief glimpses. But it's more realistic. To that end, SimCity is aiming for something different in not being meter for meter realistic, crafting an emotional connection between you, the mayor, and your city. I know there's a cadre of Skylines fans that wish the game were even more realistic, that it had even more tools built in to do even more granular adjustments, like bike lanes and specific pedestrian crossings and non-Euclidean zoning. But then there's the issue of process and results, which is why I mentioned that Skylines produces realistic results. These games, Skylines far more specifically, model how the end product will work, but the process of how cities are made in the real world still eludes the city builder genre after all these decades. I still want to talk about it in depth later, but no mayor is sitting there on their computer single-handedly crafting the physical and political trajectory of their city. Both games are unrealistic to chase their own individual goals, which is fine, but that's why the presentation matters. Maxis has spent decades crafting a unique aesthetic that's recognizable from a sim galaxy away. From its bright, cheery colors, to the Sims that inhabit their worlds with tons of personality, to the gibberish language they use, Simlish, Maxis is a storied brand. With Electronic Arts backing them going into SimCity, it's clear that they had both the expertise and the resources to design the most elaborately produced city builder ever made. If nothing else, SimCity has lavish production values and inspired creative direction. How do you even compete with that? Well, in the case of Skylines, with the development team, you can count without running out of fingers, borrow, patch things together, and do what you can. But that doesn't really excuse the lack of art direction and aesthetic unity. Start with the logo. These two typefaces really don't go together, and there's no reason for there to be two different typefaces to begin with. And then there's the cities, which might look very familiar because it's set in Price Down. Created by Ray Larrabee, a once designer at Rockstar, who created the modern Grand Theft Auto logo. He was, of course, inspired by Pinto Flare, a 70s typeface used for the hit morning American game show The Price is Right. The City Skylines logo makes absolutely no sense, and I haven't even touched on the needlessly elaborate gradients and other effects. So let's go broad for a bit, because both games do get some wins, even if one is kinda just copying the other. SimCity sports a clean, high-contrast look that's extremely stylized and designed to be very observable from any angle. When you need to dig in, the information views are incredibly useful and clear. The motion blur and tilt-shift effect really give the cities a visual character. There are animations everywhere, and they're snappy. The playable buildings have a weight and a heft to them and swing off your cursor. It feels more like a living, breathing, animated city, even if it looks more like a cartoon. There are people who aren't a fan of how this looks, and that's fine, but it's very intentional. Equally intended is that Skylines looks more realistic. There are times, especially when you turn off the interface, that your city looks like something you could see peering out of an airplane window. It is genuinely pretty at times, and when it rains, whoo boy, those reflections look slick. Although during the daytime, it just kind of makes the town look like a flooded mud slick or some really moist leather. There's even a cool cinematic view that pans and pushes over your city, although I wish it had a few more angles. I'm sure there's a mod for that. It really does look like, as so many have pointed out, a virtual Google Maps city that you're building. But that has its own pros and cons. Pro, it looks real. Con, you probably won't even know what most of these buildings are at a glance like you would in SimCity. Many of these specialized buildings look like, well, generic buildings, and it's hard to tell at a glance what so many of them are after you've built them. Because there's no real rules on tapering or visibility, areas that get really dense tend to crowd together like grass, and it can be difficult to distinguish individual structures. You may wind up knowing little more about your buildings in your Skylines town and how they contribute to the bigger picture than you would surveying an unfamiliar real town in Google Maps. That's why SimCity leans towards exaggerated and cartoony structures. Honestly, many of the building models in Skylines look like they were imported from a stock 3D library without much thought toward how they would actually work or fit in the game. But hey, it's realistic. Once you turn the interface back on and start needing to do stuff, the game part, there's a lack of visual cohesion, and sometimes this actually makes it harder to play. As the layers of information stack up with a view of your city that isn't really designed to be usable so much as realistic, things start to blend together into a visual mush, reducing the usability of the interface or just the visual coherence of what you're looking at. Sometimes when trying to place structures, I couldn't even see the road I needed to attach it to because of some other obstructing data layer. Visually, the game looks like a sandwich that was assembled by 3 different people and then slapped together. The lack of visual continuity can be a real liability because no one was defining the user experience. On sound, just some quick notes. I love that both games feature high-pitched whizzing sounds in the faster game speeds to indicate things are actually going faster in the city, like RC cars. And then there's SimCity's score by Chris Tilton, and it is incredible. It's booming and optimistic like The Outer Worlds is. And as you zoom in, stems of the songs peel away, filling in with sounds from the environment. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. But we have to address the elephant in the room. Colossal Order completely ripped SimCity's interface entirely. Some people in last year's video thought I meant Colossal Order was ripping off the entire game, but I should have been more clear. The interface is pretty much one for one. Here's what SimCity 4 looked like. Here's what SimCity looks like. Here's what Cities in Motion 2 looks like. Here's what City Skylines looks like. Here's what SimCity and Skylines look like together. They're practically identical. In fact, Skylines interface looks like the SimCity interface passed through a Mac OS filter circa 2012. But before I start picking nits, I want to call out these category buttons in the center where you access your city's various buildings and services. In SimCity, these icons are single color and neutral by default. When something requires your attention, it shifts to yellow and then red, pulsing with radial strokes. This gives you an extremely glanceable set of information to determine where you need to improve your city. In Skylines, they thought they were being clever by presenting them fully colored, so that vital information simply doesn't exist until you select them. They're ornamental, and they have no function at a glance at all, whatsoever. It just adds to the game's communication woes. And then you look closer at the UI for both games, both of which are bottom bar ribbons. Hey look, those primary department buttons we've already talked about, they're right here for both, and clicking on them brings up a secondary ribbon/box with context and options. Your RCI meter is here, and while SimCity presents demand for individual zone densities, Skylines doesn't. The region view is over here. The time controls and nameplate are right here with the exact same functionality. Your money and population are here and here. The bulldozer to destroy stuff is here, and the same hazard stripe appears in both cases. When you place a building or structure on the landscape that positively or negatively affects nearby Sims, their reactions appear as ascending, smiling, or mad faces. Both games have extremely similar info layers, but SimCity's is cleaner. And yes, you can say, hey, Cities in Motion had data layers too. They didn't copy SimCity. Except here's what those looked like, and here's... I mean, come on guys, don't die on that hill. Both games have extremely similar guidelines when laying out roads, and while I did chastise Skylines in last year's video for including a degree of attack, I actually did find it useful when laying out roads over a long distance at perpendicular angles. And then for both games, ground pollution is presented as a brown smudge on the terrain, although the buildings of Skylines tend to blend into it, and it looks really ugly and distracting. And then the Skylines tack screen wastes a lot of visual real estate. The budget screen is substantially less useful and communicates cash flows less usefully than SimCity's. The raw numbers are fine, but tell me a damn story. These diagrams look like they were whipped up in an afternoon. If I'm trying to place a building on top of existing structures to replace them, the new building glows red as if to indicate I can't put it there when actually I can. Chirpy, oh my god, Chirpy. What a useless fucking thing. I literally sought a mod to remove it. Since your citizens don't provide direct feedback about what's going on and you don't have advisors to sum up what's going on, you have Chirpy, which is this Twitter-like thing that's permanently attached to the top of your screen spewing just nonsense. Well, not entirely nonsense. Lots of your people are smoking the wacky tobacco. Lots and lots of people. In advance of SimCity's release, EA put together an interview between SimCity creator Will Wright and the new game's creative director Ocean Quigley, and Wright describes playing the game and having an emotional connection with the people who live in the city he's built. I've mentioned this several times, this emotional connection that SimCity worked really hard to cultivate with the simulated people that you're building these cities for. After The Sims released in 2000, Maxis allowed you to integrate your own Sims into SimCity 4. I'm sure it was a super fantastic and wonderful feature, but it really felt like kind of a literal and emotional cash-in with individuals you'd spent however many dozens of hours raising in another game. I touched on SimCity's advisors earlier that help communicate cause and effect, but SimCity provides an actual, well, virtual human for you to make eye contact with. In a quasi-literal sense, of course. When I made last year's video, I was actually taken aback when I discovered that there were actually people in Skylines, but only when I was at my most zoomed in. Even then, they seemed more like noise than people living there. Aside from this and the traffic simulations that are actually always enjoyable, Skylines abstracts the presence of your Sims into the cold frontier of variables, pie charts, and other passively interesting diagrams and data views. They're just numbers. I mean, they were always just numbers, but Skylines kind of just leaves them there. It doesn't elevate them to something you can have an emotional connection with. I mean, yeah, watching a shoreline flood and clicking a button to send people to a shelter you built is very fascinating in theory, but the execution seems left to your imagination. A lot of the things in this game seem left to your imagination. I've been talking about how much SimCity abstracts various elements of your city's development, but when you want more fire coverage in that game, you can dive into a fire station and literally add fire trucks, and you can see those individual agents deploy to fires. In Skylines, you increase coverage by moving a slider to the right on the budget panel, and that's it. And then it happens, largely invisible to your notice. Skylines also dances around crafting narratives by just flooding your cities with seas of icons to indicate your sim status, whether something is flooding, or people are sick, or dead, or what have you. My criticism of the game's art direction not making these designs as clear as SimCity's aside, it really just feels like this is all Colossal Order could do considering their resources. Don't get me wrong, SimCity has a lot of its own icons and can be pretty vague about what they mean at times, but Skylines has even more and puts all of its weight on them, forcing you to fill in the gaps and be your own detective about your city's issues. Couple this with the game's tutorials and lack of reference base, and it's easy for anyone to get lost trying to figure out what's even going on in your city. SimCity is a game that regularly sends up fireworks when you reach certain goals, and Skylines often feels like the fruitless pursuit of that kind of enthusiasm. It really seems like I'm bagging on Skylines, and I've said it before, it really doesn't make a good first impression, especially if you're coming off SimCity, although admittedly there aren't a whole lot of us left. SimCity has always felt like a better, more fun game out of the chute, but where Skylines begins to shine is as you progress and expand. This is also where SimCity starts to meet its limits.
SimCity is just like any other city building game in existence. While in City Skylines, you can actually build proper interchanges and cities that look like Google Maps. Also, you can properly simulate and manage a city. On top of that, in City Skylines, you can get, place, and design any building in existence due to the best modding and asset community. They look just like cities from Google Maps. That's how realistic and detailed you can make cities in City Skylines.
While real cities incorporate plans and master plans to dictate future developments, there's never an end goal for any metropolis. A population count to hit, a city size to hit, a number of cutting-edge marvels to accumulate, specific industries to attract. But what about games? One of the biggest reasons why I still revere SimCity 2000 after all these years is that it presents a kind of reachable endgame. In earlier games in the series, there's no real objective to building your city beyond reaching a financial break-even point where you're not worried about bond issues or bankruptcy. But then what? Then you fill your diamond, replacing the khaki tiles with urban development. But then what? Do you make a new city? SimCity 2000's arcologies are massive towers that serve as self-contained cities and allow you to grow your population well into the millions of sims. Suddenly, you can maximize your diamond by flattening its terrain and laying services beside those structures to gain the maximum sim to happiness ratio. It wasn't an explicit end goal scenario. You didn't unlock some achievement or reach an end screen by doing it, although if you did plant enough launch arcos, they would blast into space. No, it was all about having the tools to make your own fun that was more structured and interesting than just painting the landscape with roads, zones, and services until you ran out of room. Well, it was more structured and interesting for me, anyway. SimCity 3000 was originally slated to have arcologies, but the feature was removed for reasons that have never surfaced, which devastated 15-year-old me when the game came out. I was impressed by the game's city lots, which were now up to 4 times bigger than 2000's, but it felt like the progression treadmill was missing. SimCity 4, kind of the same story. Does not having this endgame invalidate just making a city for the sake of it? No, of course not, but what about these newer games? City Skylines and SimCity utilize regions, which are large squares of land. This isn't a new feature SimCity 4 was built on, but how these games put them to work is different. Both games feature regions that are lined with fun geographical features, your hills, rivers, and shores, but also existing transport lines like highways and rail lines to ambiguous neighbors. These regions are packed with tracks of resources to gather, although you have to spend a few extra bucks for them in Skylines because they're included with the Industries DLC. Each of Skylines' catalog maps is split into 9x9 lots. The inner 5x5 square of lots is where you actually build your city, allowing the outer frame to serve as kind of a background rather than letting you build up to the edge of a 3D space. By hitting population milestones, you get to purchase 8 additional contiguous lots for a total of 9. Of course, all of this can be changed with mods, and then you can import maps, even ones based on real geographical features like your very own town. You can make very big cities in Skylines this way, to the point where the game will even cap out on assets and turn your entire city into a monopoly board. SimCity does it differently, offering you pre-sliced lots that are designed to best take advantage of resources and interconnecting cities. These regions come in different sizes with different numbers of lots and great work sites, which are endgame structures. We'll get back to those. You can share resources between your cities, but only to an extent. In larger regions, you'll find groups of city lots huddled around individual great works, and it's hard to get stuff between these groups. It can really be a pain in the butt. If you're looking for a sequel to SimCity 4, but really beefed up, Skylines is your game. It is, at its roots, a classic SimCity-like with plenty of customization and control over detail. You can really micromanage your Skyline cities, and if you toss in mods, you can do so to oblivion. As you expand your city, you gain access to additional resources and transportation lines. Where this works to the game's advantage is a huge deal. It's not just that these cities are so much bigger than SimCities, it's that your city's growth can become a more organic experience. This means you can build distant outposts from your primary urban core that serve as their own miniature cities that have their own specialties. As time progresses, you can start filling in with neighborhoods that eventually swallow up those once distant developments. There isn't a pressure to build your city out beyond what you actually need, and 9 tiles is plenty big for any city in this game without mods. It also avoids the silly requirements of SimCity to have to set up trade deals between your little lots to get things done. Let's put a pin in City Skylines for now. When SimCity was first unveiled, Maxis really played up the notion of cooperative cities, of players working together for the greater good in the first multiplayer city builder since 1996. Or you could play it alone and build all these different parts on your own. Not only would solutions be shared across borders, but problems would as well. Criminals could start a spree in one city and then move over to another. These regions of cities used to serve as neighbors in the Sim Nation. In SimCity 2000, they were little more than adjacent burgs that developed alongside yours, with a population counter and a primitive city-size rendering. You could connect these cities with road, rail, and power lines for some kind of benefit to local commerce and industry, but to what extent, even the strategy guide is vague about. In SimCity 3000, you got to put faces to these connections and create actual deals to buy or sell access and utilities to your neighbors. In fact, they were typically annoying about this. In SimCity 4, the game presented a prefab region and allowed you to randomly generate your own with very simple parameters. Rather than have AI simulate your neighbors, you built your own network of neighboring cities of different sizes and then worked the deals between them by yourself. It sucked. But also, SimCity 4 sucked, and that's a hot take you can take to the microwave bank and do whatever with. So with these cities, you are mayor, even though your advisors seem to think that each city is run by some other person. But if you're not playing with other people, you're managing all these different lots by yourself. As you develop all these different lots by yourself, you'll understand why the always online component was such a big deal from the get-go, because it's how the game's various cities are allowed to progress in the background while you're zoomed in and working on any particular city. This is a weird experience because things don't happen immediately as you switch between these cities. Assets and agents take a while to propagate, like gifts of simoleons or utilities. Sometimes, like when you're working on a great work, progress won't even look the same as you switch cities, and you'll have to watch a stage redevelop entirely. Even when working within cities, watching as clogs of resources come in from other towns can create what looks like arrhythmia as your city tries to catch up, turning imported resources into money that can keep it afloat. These agent-based lags from other cities make me wonder if it's because the game servers are kept up as a kind of charity, or if they were ever very good. Now we have to talk about it. We can finally talk about it. We have to finally talk about the small cities. You can't make a direct comparison to Skylines lots because things aren't proportional between them, but those lots are bigger. And these lots are very small. Roughly 1.5 kilometers along each side, or about a mile, it's very small. Here's a mile-by-mile square in Western Phoenix, or here's one in Manhattan. It's not big. The thing is, there's not enough space to build an actual city. Certainly not some kind of self-sustaining enterprise like you built in the older SimCity games. As hard as I tried, you can't just build a jack-of-all-trades city that can support itself. In this region, the cities I tried to build that way, the old-fashioned way, were constantly on the brink of failure and needed persistent bailouts from the cities where I was playing the game. As soon as you start building one of these SimCity towns, you feel the pang of space anxiety. In one town, I placed my mayor's mansion in a far corner, thinking it'd remain untouched for the most part. Hours later, that modest, low-density mining town I'd built had to be continually upgraded to keep up supply for the local group to complete our greater goals. Before long, I was building right up to that once isolated mansion. As you feel the potential of the space, you're already running out of it. As soon as you run out of space, the game pleads with you to build a bunch of structures to sustain it, or start work on another city to build those structures to sustain that city and then this one. Want to build this thing? Well, you can't, because you need this HQ building that takes up a whole bunch of space, and then a daughter building that also takes up a whole bunch of space. You may finally have the ability to do something with the lot's rail connection, but you've built a neighborhood there. Guess you're gonna have to demolish it to squeeze that trade depot in there, and then demolish that expensive trade post you just built and can't get a refund for, and then demolish an entire other neighborhood so you can fit in the module that allows your new trade depot to connect to the rail system. Oh, and you can't build lots to trade any specific resources until you build that HQ building and subsequent add-on, which will also take up a space and require you to demolish another neighborhood so you can... So this is why we have specializations. When picking a lot, you'll get a loadout on what resources are available, so you'll understand what that city is ultimately going to be doing, or really should be doing. You may not have a plan for these lots when you dive in, beyond setting up the proper mining equipment, but you will. Whatever you don't gain through mining or through refining what you mine, you can set up elaborate recycling facilities to gather resources from the trash collected around town, provided your town is big enough to gather that much trash. And then you can choose what material lines you're focusing on gathering. This is where we enter the mid-game, the point where we realize that no amount of playing by convention is going to help us, and the hand-holdy tutorial didn't prepare us for this in the slightest. Very simply, you can't just have one city in this game. You're gonna have multiple cities. You just have to. Thankfully, you're not starting from scratch each time, or you shouldn't be, depending on how well you've built up your other towns. Yeah, I mean, you can transfer in a bunch of money to help your new town out, but when you have a number of established cities, you can lean on them for resources and services, provided they're providing an excess. Instead of having to establish power and water plants each time, you can just buy those services from your neighbors. What this ultimately means is that each new city will eventually get large enough that you have to either switch back to those other towns to upgrade for the increased regional demand, or you have to start building those facilities into the limited space you have left in your new town. Choices, choices. On the flip side, you can build really complex, wealthy cities that let you support your other smaller cities when they're on the brink of failure, and issuing bonds and jacking up all your taxes isn't going to save them. While SimCity is better about communicating broader issues, this inner-city drama can get a bit chaotic, and you may not truly understand why a city is having the issues it has, or why this city has this and this one doesn't, or why you've just run out of money, or whatever. This is the point where SimCity becomes a bit of a noisy mess. The game shifts dramatically when you realize that the only way your towns are ever going to make progress financially is to exploit the resources that the lots are built on top of, and sell those, or build products with those resources and then sell them. With trade depots, you can do just that, and it's here that the game becomes a supply chain management sim like Factorio, Satisfactory, or Dyson Sphere Project. You have to treat these cities as either resource gatherers or resource processors, or both, and there are hierarchies here. You can't just plop down a processor factory and a bus terminal to import knowledgeable workers. No. You have to build an adequate, wealthy, educated city, then unlock and build basic facilities to build the more advanced facilities, and so on, each time. And the space in which you can do that is very limited. What I discovered is that balancing the books is extremely difficult, and my successful towns ran bigger and bigger deficits, which were more than easily offset by the sale of expensive electronics manufactured in town. This is where the agent model is both fascinating to watch when it works, and frustrating when it doesn't freaking work. When you play a game like Factorio or Satisfactory, you are always very aware of what's going on with your resources because they materialize as actual objects on open-air conveyor belts between machines. When they stop appearing, you know exactly, at a glance, where things have gone wrong and can diagnose and repair the issue with your supply line. SimCity, having released a few years before even Factorio, doesn't offer this kind of transparency or storytelling. The most important information view becomes the trade view, where you can see trucks importing and exporting valuable resources, either for money to continue operations, or off to another town to continue their vital work. The most frustrating component of all this will come when traffic will get stuck just outside your town and out of your reach of control. You can't do a thing about it except watch, and your city will grind to a halt if this takes too long for the game to resolve, and it will begin the financial death spiral, and it will be completely out of your hands. Even when you succeed, you will face two big struggles: keeping each city going and then optimizing each city without breaking it. You will hop between these cities back and forth, load screens, resource and agent lag and everything to make sure different parts of the supply line are still working. You have to make sure individual resources aren't getting hung up, and you have enough workers to keep those facilities staffed, which was a perpetual issue despite having plenty of education, parks, police, fire, and health services to maximize land values, building densities, and sim education. So then you've got to optimize. You've got to fill your city's goals inside your city's tiny lot, and sometimes it involves choosing what limb to chop off so you can eventually add another head. You will eventually reach a stage of this game where you are destroying very, very expensive and important chunks of your city and rebuilding them in very precise ways. This can be very challenging when the neighborhoods you're destroying to put in these facilities are vital to house the Sims you need to run these facilities to begin with. It's vicious, like solving a Rubik's Cube with your hands tied. But what are you doing with all these resources aside from hopefully making enough money to keep your cities from drowning fiscally? This is when SimCity's endgame objectives come into view, those great works. You can research different projects with local universities with solar farms that will probably resolve all of your power issues, an arcology that will send you tourists, an international airport, and more. These projects need different resources and products, and you can send them from individual cities. Although I had to play a game where I'd save up enough money to shut off my city's profit flow, hopefully send some of the needed resource off to the great work, then crank the faucet to sing back again to the Sim Nation so the city doesn't self-destruct. One of the game's great mysteries is, when the hell is the trade depot that is full of the specific resource going to send it out to the great work? And there is no real answer. It'll just sit there in the trade depot and send it out when it wants to, even if the depot is fully manned. And if you switch the depot from keeping the resource local for the great work to then export for money, it will export for money almost immediately. It makes no sense. And then the whole process lags as you switch between cities. You can complete the great work and get the celebration, and it's all fun after all that work, but then it still needs more resources or whatever, and you're not quite sure how that And this is where SimCity just falls apart as the game it always wanted to be. And heaven forbid you try and do this over multiplayer these days, but even in 2013 you had to deal with the real terrible situation where someone may drop out and leave their lot just abandoned. And you and your fellow gamers can't reclaim the dead lot. It's lost forever. So don't try to play multiplayer. Just don't. SimCity could have done so much more, but it was too busy being killed by its publisher. I theorize in my heart of hearts that the game could have been so much better and easier if the city lots had simply been twice as long on each side, effectively 4 times the area. I know they tried. I know they killed the game's performance, but with that kind of space, you can comfortably manage the city without reorganization being so stressful, while maintaining the urgency to specialize each city's industry. Maxis could have done it had they simply been given the support they needed, or really if they didn't have the always online component that sent their servers to hell and back. SimCity is an epic failure, a flaming wreck bobbing at sea that disintegrated into planks, and then nothing. But then look, I'm not done with City Skylines. While SimCity spends its latter game atomizing to ash, Skylines chases something different. So let's talk about that industry's DLC, because it matches what I really enjoy about SimCity. It's a bummer you have to pay extra for it, but for my goals, it was worth the money. Other DLCs add mechanics and content, but Industry adds that endgame I really kinda wanted out of both games, even if there is no arcology at the end of the productivity rainbow. To remind you of Skylines' interface issues, though, it hides all of these specialty industry buildings and tools under the garbage menu, so that's cool. With each Skylines map are swaths of resources, just like SimCity. Before selecting a new tile to expand your city into, you get meters indicating how many of that resources it has, just like SimCity. You don't just plop down these buildings though, you establish a district first, which helps you coordinate where all of your buildings are going to go and keep things organized, even if it's more for your organizational sake than anything that the game needs. Each industry comes with extraction and refining elements and a kind of cheesy meter that lets you see how well you're extracting materials and what you're doing with them. These industry districts, whether forestry, oil, coal, farming, can be leveled up as you build them out, and their end products can be funneled into generic-looking production facilities to make toys and shoes and other crap. Those can then be sent to warehouses, which serve the same function as SimCity's trading depots for extra income. Functionally, it's all very similar to SimCity's mid and end game, with more detail and substantially less emotional feedback. Also, while you grow some of these industries, others rely on resource pits that dry up very quickly. You are constantly staking out new mines and extraction sites, but before long, it's all gone. SimCity seemed to have this perpetual, or at least plentiful, resource pits that you didn't need to micromanage like that. None of this would be such a big deal if having to periodically set up new mines were fun. But there is so much less stress playing with industries here. With a few tweaks, it'd be close to perfect. With better presentation, I'd feel like my industries were accomplishing something beyond just populating information panels with color-coded variables, increasing vehicle traffic, and then propping up the balance sheet. But then I realized in comparing these things what the appeal of Skylines is. I made this game interesting for me in the same way that others make the game interesting for them. These industries don't exist unless you buy the DLC, but a lot of people don't need this extra layer to have fun with this game. Heck, as I was mentioning earlier, traffic management is a fun game in and of itself. City Skylines is a game where you make your own fun. That's the whole thing, that's the whole catch. You don't need more unless you want more, and you shape the game to your desires just like you would Lego. SimCity gives you a Technic Bugatti Chiron and presents a high in putting together an intricate model with lots and lots of bespoke pieces that have some incredible functionality and a gorgeous result. Skylines gives you a classic bucket and tells you to have fun, and if you want to add extra sets and bricks to it, you can. Everything's compatible and familiar, but what do you want to do? What kind of player are you?
I think you're being fundamentally unfair to City Skylines. You've approached it with the assumption that it's exactly like SimCity. You actually say you think they copied SimCity and added a bunch of junk, but then you're disappointed to discover that you were wrong. It's not like SimCity. It was never a copy at all. And you're very unforgiving that it did not meet your preconceived expectations, and you resent anything you're not familiar with, even if it's a more realistic simulation of a real city.
City Skylines and SimCity are two different kinds of games for two different kinds of gamers. With enough time in both games, it becomes apparent that a direct comparison is futile. They may start similarly, but where they go and how they get there can be vastly different. SimCity is a lean-in experience. There's a persistent sense of urgency, a tension, a want to keep going and resolve and refine and build and upgrade and so on. You can't just make a city, you have to craft a cog in a greater machine. The presentation evokes the visual and emotional intensity of opening loot boxes, or like in Satisfactory, watching new sophisticated components roll out of a machine that you've just spent hours configuring an entire supply chain to manufacture. SimCity builds up, not out. It was designed to do something very different and to not follow in the same linear progression as its predecessors. The series has always worshipped its sim citizens, but here they feel alive and animated and real, whether they're commuting or advising or having their thoughts read by an omnipotent god mayor. City Skylines, however, is a lean-back experience. You set your own pace, you can micromanage your way to success, and sometimes you actually do. But to what extent that is, or to what extent success is in your town, well, that's up to you. You make your own fun. You don't need to paint your cities to the edge of your landmass if you don't want to. As soon as you begin to feel penned in, you get access to another tile and the anxiety just melts away. You can have curvy roads without immediately feeling that you're going to run out of space. If the game today isn't to your liking, through some persistence and sometimes a hell of a lot of research and work, you can make whatever game you want to out of this. Yeah, you could probably build a perfect analog to EA's game as possible using the game's mods, if that's what you wanted. So we go back to the original question, is City Skylines a terrible SimCity? In some ways, it clearly is, from its lack of personality, to its lack of connective tissue to your citizens, to its just outright obtuseness and minutia madness. It really misses the point of the series. When you consider that it's 12 years newer than SimCity 4 and forgive its flaws, it's very easy to see how this is a dressed-down version of what might have been SimCity 5, primarily because it borrows so much of what SimCity did right, including that interface. Colossal Order welcomed the fact that Maxis made their latest city builder a very un-SimCity-like SimCity, something weird and different, so that they could make a game that classic fans would appreciate with mature gameplay at its core. But let's be clear, if SimCity hadn't failed so poorly out of the gate, and been killed so quickly by its corporate overlords, we would not be talking about City Skylines at all. It would not exist. Maxis Emeryville, the studio that built SimCity, was closed the same month that Skylines released, so these games never competed commercially. SimCity was dead before Skylines was even born. And if EA had stuck with SimCity and fixed it and built it out, as I'm sure some 3 to 5 year plan once detailed, there would have been people who stuck with the older SimCity games. That's just how things are. But let me be absolutely 100% clear here on this particular point. Electronic Arts is a destroyer of dreams. Long before Activision's Bobby Kotick and his commodity men slowly became the villains of non-stop Call of Duty releases that take up entire hard drives and the corrosive decay experts of the iconic Blizzard, Electronic Arts was loud and proud about how much they did not care about gamers or games. They've killed or tarnished countless legendary studios, run franchises into the ground, hijacked legendary properties and melded them to the chintziest monetary schemes, on and on. Let's go back to E3 2012 when Electronic Arts and Maxis unveiled SimCity's gameplay for the first time. Did they open with their magical new game? No, they opened with a Cityville ripoff for Facebook. Fact, that's aged terribly. SimCity is a flawed game, but it's a spirited one. EA wanted the always online connectivity that ruined the game out of the gate, but ignoring that, something far easier to do these days, you can see that a lot of this game was made in the absence of EA's meddling. There's a purity in its design and ambition that doesn't reek of their publishers' conniving bullshit. Too much. Anyway. And had EA supported Maxis, they would have gotten those city lots to be bigger. It would have been a more fulfilling game. It would have been the reigning champion of city builders today, undoubtedly. SimCity's failure was so thorough and complete that you don't need 300 people and tens of $1 million to fill the city builder chasm. You could just fund a dozen ambitious Finns to build their dream project and toss a few bills to promote it. And that's exactly what Paradox did. It would be so easy for me to speculate about what SimCity could have been, which reminds me of Enemy Nations, a game that you've never heard of and was quickly forgotten by everyone not long after it released anyway. I could seriously only find one Let's Play of this game, and it was in German. It dared to merge SimCity and Command & Conquer in 1997, and it was once going to be published by Virgin before they gave up on the whole video games thing. Their biggest problem is that the game couldn't pull it off. But what if? I don't need to wonder what if with SimCity. I have Factorio and Satisfactory and Dyson Sphere Project for all the supply chain management cravings I didn't know I had. Sure, you're not building a city along the way, but that's a minor point considering how enjoyable these games are. This video may seem like a eulogy for SimCity 2013, but as I compare these games, I realize that it's kind of a eulogy for the series too. It's been 9 years since EA unveiled SimCity, and while they've had some success with their Build It game on mobile, there's a sense that Maxis and EA are waiting a half-life to try again. But there are so many things wrong with this approach. First off, SimCity deserves a much better publisher than EA, and no, I don't think it's Paradox. Secondly, SimCity is toxic because EA let it be. They decided to let it be a Chernobyl and let its radioactivity wither to the wind over years rather than cleaning it up and owning it. Thirdly, how would EA let anyone be so creative with SimCity ever again? Whether you agree with 2013's design decisions or not, the game was ambitious as hell, and again, it's a kind of miracle that they let Ocean Quigley and Maxis make something as daring as this, even if the technology wasn't quite there and the publisher was being a piece of shit, as usual. It's hard to imagine some inevitable SimCity sequel not being some back-to-formula retreat that just reskins what SimCity 2000 did almost 30 years ago. But as I put forward in a video last year, we need new city builders anyway. Not just new games, but new ideas. Even City Skylines, as traditional and popular as it is, still adheres to the same threads that Will Wright laid out with his original game in 1989, back when he was building out a glorified map editor to make simulated cities. Build infrastructure, zone RCI, add services, the city fills itself in. Is this how these games will always be built? Where are the master plans and proposals? Where are the citizen initiatives? What about homelessness or police brutality? Knowing where people go to work or school is fun information, but what do they really think about their bus route? Or the fact that the light rail doesn't get them where they need to go? Why can't you lay out what a new rail line in your city will look like and test it before committing to the full construction cost and hoping it'll solve your problems? What if you had to put major projects on a ballot for your people to vote on? Where's the actual learning of how things happen in the real world? Again, no city is single-handedly built by an omnipotent god mayor. And where are your real connections to state and federal governments for grants and disaster relief? Where is your red phone to the governor for that rail connection? I said it a number of times earlier, but Skylines can produce accurate-looking results. But the process of how you get there is not how anything actually happens. I know what this next-generation city builder looks like and how it plays, but it's hard to describe it in the conclusion of a video review because so many new ideas are needed for other new ideas to become reality. Or fun. We get a taste of how cities can grow organically in Skylines that's incredibly refreshing, but it's still your index finger on the mouse or controller button with each and every aspect. City Skylines, with all the mods I can download and install, just won't ever be the city builder I've been dying for, even if those mods and DLCs have improved my opinion of it dramatically. With its deep flaws that will never be fixed, unfortunately, SimCity isn't that game either. What I want is what comes next, what really changes the entire genre. It's been long enough. It may not be the first, but it is the nth review. I'm your host, Nick. I need to thank my Patreon supporters here who are my sponsors and allowed this video to happen in the first place at all. I need to thank you, my viewers, for coming and watching as I pet my dog. If you've made it this far and you haven't hit the like button, please go hit it. It's down here. I know it is. Go hit the like button, smash it, do whatever you gotta do for the algorithm, the almighty algorithm. Such a great time. If you're not subscribed, please go subscribe. That's also down there. And you can hit the notification bell. That's cool too. You can do that as well. Check out the Patreon. This video was made possible because of my Patreon supporters. Not only do you help me to bring these videos out quicker and more often, you also get cool perks like a monthly Q&A and special Discord channels and stuff like that. You get to talk with me when we're in the green room. Speaking of the green room, I've got 2 live streams a week. 2 live streams a week. Come check it out. You have to come check it out. Green room on Tuesdays between 7 and 9 p.m. Mountain Standard. And the Nth Forum, a panel show with a couple of friends of the Nth. Come by and we talk about gaming and stuff that isn't gaming as well. Don't forget to join the Discord. We're having conversations all the time about everything. We talk about games. We really talk about games. We talk about games working, and we definitely talk about games not working. Don't forget, social media is everywhere. And don't forget, there's a cat right there happening. And hey, I'll see you next time.